Now it's that time of the week again as we continue our plunge through the Rugby World Cup on land of the Rising Scrum. After we jumped ahead to Wales last week, we're coming back to Pool C today to look at everyone's favourite rugby enigma, France. 3 times a finalist at the tournament in 1987, 1999 and 2011. The French have never won it though, and arguably in 2019 they look as far away from winning it as they ever did. In the toughest looking pool this time round, alongside England, Argentina, the USA and Tonga. Now joining me first up this week, I have a second row who won 54 French caps between 2003 and 2011, playing in 2 World Cups and winning 4 Six Nations titles. Biarritz legend Jerome Thion, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting. Thank you very much.
In my introduction, I said that France, they look as far away from winning the World Cup as they ever have been. Do you think that's true at the moment?
Well, it's going to be very hard for the French team. You can see during the tournament how it was hard for the French team to win the game, and the game playing wasn't very, very, very clear. So maybe with the new coach, with Fabien Galtier, who's come with the French team, and a new physical coach, it will be maybe better than we can see during the tournament, not the Six Nations, but it's going to be hard for the guys for the World Cup this year.
Going back to your days in France in 2003 and 2007, when we look back at those, France were a team that every World Cup people actually thought they had a good chance of winning it. They were one of the contenders to win it. Whereas this year, is there a real fear that they may not even get out of the pool because England and Argentina are looking quite strong at the moment as well?
You can see during the tournament, during the team like Argentina who played for the formation, they play against the All Blacks. They lose a very, very, very short game, and for the England team, you know that they will be good for the World Cup with the coach, with the preparation during the tournament. You can see this team is very, very precious during the game. So it's going to be hard for the French team. Maybe it's the hardest pool they can have for the World Cup.
And if France were to fail to get out of the pool, would that be a complete disaster back in France, or are the expectations, have they just dropped a lot over the last few years?
No, I think everybody knows that it's going to be hard for the French team, and everybody wants to see for the future with the young team, with the 120 years old guys who won the World Cup, the World Championships 2 times. So maybe the French looks forward. They look 4 years after, and for the World Cup in France. Maybe they are focused on this.
Yeah, your own background, you actually started rugby quite late. You played basketball for a long time in your teens. What brought you to rugby eventually?
What? Sorry, I didn't understand.
How did you get introduced to rugby eventually? Because you played basketball for a long time.
It was very, very, very bizarre for me because I played basketball during the school and during the semi-professional when I was in the high school in France, and I started playing rugby at 20 years old with a friend who introduced me in the Racing Club de France. Was the team, my first team where I played, and I discovered this sport and the ambience and the team spirit you can have in the rugby. So I changed and I started to playing rugby at 20 years old, and after it was a good opportunity for me to be a professional during 50 years.
And so you were 20 before you played any rugby at all?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. And by the time you were 25, you were playing for France in a World Cup.
Yeah, for the first time, I was selected for the French team during the tournament just before the World Cup in 2003 for Argentina 2 times, and won the New Zealand when I played for l'USAP in Perpignan, and I was in the squad for 2003 for the World Cup. It was my first World Cup for me, and I was a young guy.
Was it a complete new experience? Because in 2003, you got to the semi-finals, you were beaten by England, who went on to win it. But for you, who had only been playing rugby just a few short years, was this all just a kind of a fairy tale?
The evolution of the team during 2003 was not too bad, because I thought that we had a very good team during this World Cup, and you can imagine, and if you remember the game we lose against England when the weather was a lot of rain, and we haven't got any game plan for the rain. I'm very sad about that, because maybe we had the best team for France to go higher and to go to the final, but it was very, very hard for us. And in 2007 it was not the same way, because we lose against one more time against England, but before we played the quarterfinal against New Zealand in Cardiff, and it was a little bit different, the approach of the game for the semi-final, but it was absolutely a good experience for us and for me to play those two World Cups.
In 2007, France hosted the World Cup. Did you feel a lot of pressure as the host of the tournament?
Yeah, I just told you that it was hard for us. We didn't take the dimension of of this tournament, because it was in France. The first game was against Argentina. Mm. And we lose the first game, and it was absolutely hard for us to focus on the end of the tournament. But the coach Bernard Laporte said to us, "Okay, we're going to be focused. You know that we're going to play against. If we go out of the pool, we're going to play against New Zealand. It's going to be hard. So we focus on this game in Cardiff for the quarterfinal against New Zealand, and." We won the game, but after maybe it was the game was too hard for us to win against England for the semi-final.
And you mentioned there the pressure when you hosted the tournament. That game against New Zealand, it was in Wales, it was in Cardiff in the end. So did that kind of take a bit of pressure off you going into that New Zealand game? Were you able to relax a little bit more?
No, we've been relaxed about that game, because everybody think that we will lose the game, because we played against New Zealand. It was the first nation. It was on the rank. It was the first nation of rugby. But during the week before the game, we didn't have any pressure on the shoulder, because we were in Cardiff without pressure of the French. And we knew that maybe we can we can beat them, and we can do a very good game against New Zealand. It was like this, so no pressure on the shoulder. And but after, when we played after the semi-final against England, it wasn't not the same way.
In the game against New Zealand, before the match, you and all your teammates, you walked up to face the haka together, and you were wearing the blue, white and red T-shirts to make the France tricolour. Whose idea was that in the team to do that?
One of the leader of the team who do that for the pre-game, and nobody knows that before the game. It was Rafa Ibanez who gave the T-shirt to everybody, and they said, "Okay, so now we're gonna be in the front of the haka, and we're gonna focus on your guys, and maybe it's gonna be a destabilization of the team." But it was the first time that we done that.
A lot of teams have tried doing things like that before, and it hasn't worked out too well. They've been beaten heavily. It worked out okay for France in the end, though, because it's one of the most famous World Cup matches, I think, of the last 20 years. Everyone expected New Zealand to win, and France coming from behind to win as well. Does that make the disappointment of the England semi-final just even greater, though?
I don't think it make the difference, but they were surprised that we done that, and they were surprised that we focus each guys on the men we're going to play, and they were very surprised always when they do the haka, and we on the front of the row. It was a special moment for us and for them.
After that World Cup, Mark Lieberman came in. You were still in the team until the Six Nations in 2011, and after you lost against Italy, Mark Lieberman, he called a number of players cowards, and you were one of the many kind of senior players who were dropped after that game. Was that a real a real low moment in your career?
Yeah, I was a little bit disappointed because it would be the third World Cup I can play, and we were with Yannick Jauzion, with Sébastien Chabal, a lot of maybe old guys in the team, and we are fired for the game we lose against Italy. I can understand that, but 2 weeks ago, Mark Lieberman came in my room and say, "Okay, Jerome, we need to got you for the World Cup, so stay focused on your job, and you will do the World Cup with us in 2011." And 2 weeks later, wasn't the same discourse. So it's like a little bit hard for me, but it's the game, so it's like this. And maybe I will do the World Cup, but with this game against Italy, it was different for us, for a lot of old guys who play for France, like Yannick Jauzion, like Sébastien Chabal and me, and Clément Poitrenaud.
And is it hugely disappointing that was the last time you got to play for France, that game against Italy?
Yeah, exactly. It was my last game.
I'm sorry to bring up bad memories.
No problem. You know, every tournament, every time we play against Italy, every journalist called me, "Okay, Jerome, so how is it between when you play against Italy?" I'm okay with that. There is no problem. But it was the end of my international career like this, and I played after with Paris for the Hash Cup, and it was a good experience for me and for the guys I play with.
And finally, just one question: what is your prediction for France at this World Cup?
Oh, I hope they will do a good game, and we will see. But we haven't got any. Maybe they're gonna take some opportunity to win the game, but it's gonna be very hard to go out of this pool. It's maybe the hardest pool of the World Cup, but. With Fabien Galtier, maybe they will have a good opportunity to go out of this pool and make the surprise. French makes a lot of surprise for the World Cup, so I hope it's going to be like this for this World Cup.
And also, do you have any advice for a young player who's coming to rugby late in his career? Maybe in his late teens, he's only picking up the sport. What advice would you give to someone if they want to take it seriously and go on and play 50 times for their country?
Oh, we just they just need to take out the pressure they can have on the shoulder and take every opportunity they can have for playing for the team and take some pleasure on the pitch, because we play for that.
Jerome, thank you for speaking to us here on Off the Ball.
Thank you very much.
Yes, that was former France second row Jerome Thion speaking to us on Land of the Rising Scrum. And just a reminder, our rugby coverage on Off the Ball is brought to you by Vodafone. Team of us, everyone in. You can also listen back to any of our previous episodes on offtheball.com/podcasts or on the Go Loud app. And you can also watch these back as well on YouTube, on Off the Ball's YouTube channel. Now, as I said, I spoke to Jerome Thion just there, and joining me on the line now, I actually have a second former France international and a former teammate of Jerome's as well. Tony Marsh is joining me on the line from Auckland. Tony, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
I was speaking to your former teammate Jerome Thion there. He had a very interesting backstory about coming into rugby, pretty inexperienced, 20 years of age when he first got a taste of rugby or played it at any level whatsoever. You yourself, born in New Zealand and grew up there as well, I imagine rugby was something that came to you much earlier in your life.
Yeah, for sure. I think, especially when I grew up, rugby was pretty much it here in New Zealand. I guess it's, as we all know, rugby is, probably what still is the be all and end all, so they say here. So it's our number one sport, and having a sporty sort of upbringing and parents who are into sport, I guess it was a given that, I got led down that path and sort of especially directed towards rugby. So I had a twin brother, or still got a twin brother, so, from the early ages of 3 and 4, we're out in the backyard, playing our rugby, and then, from the age of 5 years, joined our local club team, and didn't look back really. From there, it was rugby every day, all day.
And obviously, though, we're here talking about your career with France. At what stage did you make the move over there in your life? What were the circumstances around it? How the move came about?
Yeah, so in 1998, I decided to look towards the shores of the Northern Hemisphere in France. So I think I was one of the first players that transitioned from the amateur era into the pro era, and back then the contracts were a little bit different in terms of NZRFU had a lot of the power back then. So I was contracted at the start of 1998. I didn't make a super team, having played for the Blues in 97. I didn't get picked up, and it was only through injury really that I ended up at the Crusaders in 1998. So that alongside of the fact that, again, the NZRFU has sort of had the power, and the fact that if you weren't, even if you signed a 3-year contract, if you weren't picked up in a squad, if you got injured, they didn't have to pay you. So at the age of 26, which was young back then, I decided to head offshore. And at the time, no one really did it. The guys sort of did that towards the end of their career. So it was a little bit different. So I headed to Clermont-Ferrand in the centre of France with, the goal wasn't to play international rugby, but 3 years later I was playing on that blue jersey.
And specifically moving to Clermont, were you sought out by them? Did you have to kind of put your name out there around Europe? Were there any other kind of options that you might have had around that time?
No, at the start of 1998, as I said, I wasn't picked up, and I was actually talking to Leicester at the time, and back then, I don't know if you can remember, but Bob Dwyer, the ex-Australian coach, was their coach, and they had sort of, I was in discussions with them, but at the last minute got picked up by the Crusaders through injury. So at the end of the Crusaders campaign, I got contacted by an agent here who was, asked if I was interested, and to be fair, I wasn't. I had a great year at the Crusaders. We ended up winning the Super 12 that it was back then. But, I was in the process of re-signing and thought, I'll have a look at this contract. And long story short was basically I decided that 1999 World Cup, there's a few players going to head offshore. I don't think at the time I was good enough to pull on that black jersey, so decided to head offshore and live an experience in France.
And obviously you had to go through your 3-year residency, but I imagine at some stage before that 3-year period elapsed when you were in France, the prospect of becoming a French international was becoming more and more real. I presume people had been speaking to you about it or sounding you out on your thoughts about playing for France. How did you feel as a New Zealander coming in, and I suppose at what stage along that path did the thought of playing for France actually become a little bit more real?
Yeah, well, my 3 years was coming up, and there's a little bit of talk about it. Excuse me, a little bit of talk about it. But to be fair, I probably hadn't really thought about it a hell of a lot. I think what happened when I first got selected is that in 2001 for the November Test Series, I wasn't initially selected, and then they got an injury through the week. So I remember it was a Tuesday night sitting in a restaurant having dinner with a couple of mates, and I got a phone call from the then French manager, Joe Mazzo. He said, we've had an injury. We want you to come to Paris and play Saturday. It was against South Africa. So it was something that happened really, really quickly. I didn't have time to think about it, which probably in hindsight was a good thing. I guess for me, the only question that I had, and being born in New Zealand and growing up in New Zealand, the goal was always, obviously, when I was here playing my rugby in New Zealand, was to play for the All Blacks. That wasn't the case, but the only question I had was, given the fact that I was born here, my roots are from here, could I really do justice to that French jersey? And so I think, I'm the type of bloke who's pretty honest. As when I pull on any jersey, I want to give it 100%. So, that I guess question was covered up pretty quickly, and that any doubts I had, about whether I could do it justice sort of went out the window from there.
Earlier on in this series, we've kind of been going through team by team throughout the World Cup and kind of looking back at some of the players. And when we covered Italy, I spoke to another New Zealander, Paul Griffin, and he obviously has a similar story to you, where he kind of moved over to Italy in the late 1990s, and it wasn't really until a few years into it where the idea of becoming an Italy international entered his mind. And he was saying that in the early stages he felt a lot of pressure on himself, because back then there weren't too many players born outside of Italy representing the national team at that time. And it's a similar story for France, for you. Obviously now there are a lot more players. There's some South Africans in there and some guys from the Pacific Islands. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was largely a French-born team and a French-nurtured team. Did you feel a lot of that pressure?
Yeah, I'd be lying if I say I didn't. I think that, going along with my first selection, there's a little bit about a talk about that I was taking the place of a French player, and I totally understand that. And there was a little bit of criticism around the French management and coaches selecting me. There were a couple other foreigners in the team at the time, but I guess I was probably one of the first outside backs that sort of got selected for the French team. So I understood that. So for me, my perspective, even though I was welcomed into the French team and the management treated me very well, I think there was all an underlying, pressure for me that, I always felt that I had to do a little bit more, which, again, I think was probably justified. I was just, there's a little bit of pressure, and, I had to deal with it and make sure that probably, if anything, I justified my selection.
Yeah, it's something that we're kind of seeing a lot over in Ireland as well. There are, guys like Bundy Aki and CJ Stander in recent years have kind of been scrutinised a lot more maybe than the Irish-born players have in the team. Do you think it's just a kind of a natural reaction that people would have to someone that has come in the professional game, and as you say, you kind of almost feel like you are taking the place of an Irish player in the team? As good as you feel you are, or as confident as you feel you are, is it just a kind of a natural reaction to have in those circumstances?
Yeah, I think so, 100%. I guess, especially if you have a look at, you've mentioned Ireland and, a lot of the other Six Nation teams are similar. France today, I think, there's a big issue around the number of foreigners, not only playing in the French competition, but also playing in that French team. And I guess, even from me, looking at this French team today, you look at it and I'm dismayed really by the number of foreigners that are playing in that team, which is quite ironic, being the fact that, I was in that situation myself some, 15 odd years ago. But yeah, when you think about it, France and I think other nations should be privileging their own players, their homeborn players, and enticing them to pull on their home team's jersey. So, I get it. I guess it's a question mark for a lot of teams. Is do they bring in foreigners? over homeborn players, but I guess it's just a sign of the times, really.
Is it kind of maybe more of a modern phenomenon that kind of 15 to 20 years ago, guys like yourself or Paul Griffin, who I spoke to, guys who ended up playing for countries outside of their home nation, they kind of found themselves there by circumstance. They had taken a contract and gone over, and as the years went on, the prospect of playing for that country became real. Whereas now these days, not just in France, but in Ireland, we do it as well over here, and you see it in other countries where guys are kind of scouted from an early age and brought over with the long-term ambition of, in 5 or 6 years' time, we want to make an international out of you.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, and that's exactly what I was going to say. So, when I went to France, there's absolutely zero ambition for playing for France. I think, I decided that I just wanted the experience offshore, and I wanted to do something else. So, never did I imagine that 3 years later I'd be playing in that French jersey. So times have changed, as you said. I think you grow up with one, the ambition of being a pro rugby player, and secondly, playing for your international team. But then secondly, you've also got that pathway where potentially, you can head overseas at an early age with the dream of not only playing professional rugby, but also playing for another international rugby team, and I guess it's opened the doors for a lot of players who, if they had stayed in their home country, they wouldn't be playing international rugby. So, yeah, it's definitely a pathway. And, you have a look at the likes of even Clermont where I played in France. They've got links with for example, France and several other smaller nations where they can, take their players, their best players, take them into the academy system at a young age. And again, 3 years later, they're classed as a local player or French player. And in the case of Clermont, you've seen a couple of their Fijian boys who have just been picked up for the World Cup now.
Mm-hmm. We are obviously talking about the World Cup, and we kind of look back on the World Cup journeys of players who come on this show. And your journey to the 2003 tournament, it was an incredibly difficult one because you had returned from treatment for testicular cancer just a few months earlier. It was something that jumped out at me watching. It was only... How long after your diagnosis were you playing in the World Cup?
So I was diagnosed in February 2003, so underwent 6 weeks of chemotherapy from March. And then, pretty much 6 months later, I was on the plane to Australia to play in the World Cup. And, in hindsight, and it's easy to say now, in hindsight, I probably wasn't ready and I shouldn't have got on that plane.
Yeah.
Even though I only had 6 months of chemo, it really took it out of me. So, 2 days going into the 2 months build up into that World Cup, I got injured, so I tore calf training. And so I missed 6 weeks of the build up into 6 of our 8 weeks build up into that World Cup. So, sort of 4 weeks into that 6 weeks, I contemplated pulling out, and I actually remember talking to the doctor and said, I'm going to pull the pin. I can't go to a World Cup in this condition, and I'm very much underprepared. But he said, no, stick with it. You're going to be fine. So, yeah, I did. I had 2 weeks of training. I played, I think it was 60-odd minutes of rugby, and there I was playing in the World Cup. So, funnily enough, at the end of that World Cup, I was a player in the French squad that had played the most minutes of rugby. So, which is quite ironic as well.
When you were undergoing that treatment, was the World Cup kind of this small target in your mind, something to kind of keep you going through on those incredibly tough days that you kind of had mapped out that, okay, I'm going to fight this with everything I can, and in 6 months' time, I want to be there at a World Cup, and just to prove yourself, I suppose, almost.
Yeah, it was quite funny because when I was diagnosed, they gave me the choice of whether or not I wanted to have chemo, and so it was either one, undergo chemo, or secondly, have checkups every month, with the risk of obviously it being something more serious. So I made the decision that I wouldn't take any risk and I'd undergo my chemo. But I guess from there, I didn't know if I was going to make the World Cup. I think the World Cup squad was announced in July, but I guess getting back on the football field was as soon as possible was my goal, and it was a driving factor. I guess that helped me recover, and it was my focus is getting up and running as soon as I could. So I didn't know that I was going to make the World Cup, but the goal was that whether I made that squad or if I didn't, that I could start or not be far off starting the season for Clermont-Ferrand. So, yeah, it was a big motivational and driving factor for me getting back on the rugby field, yeah.
And when you actually did get back on the field, I imagine the treatment physically had taken an enormous amount out of you. Like, how much work did you actually have to build back up once you got back out there? As you said, you ended up injuring yourself. I imagine that was probably down to overtraining almost and pushing yourself a little bit too far.
Yeah, I don't know if it was overtraining. Looking back, I think it was probably one of the side effects to my treatment, because over probably a 2-year period following my treatment, I really struggled physically. I think mentally I was there, but I had niggle after niggle after niggle, and specifically around the World Cup, I remember getting off the plane in Sydney when we flew in, and my Achilles were a little bit sore, and by game 2 of the World Cup, I was actually really, really struggling with my Achilles. So by the end of it, I remember waking up in the morning and I could hardly walk, let alone pull on a pair of rugby boots and play a semi-final in the World Cup. But it was something that I grit the teeth and got through. But again, 18 months following that World Cup, I really, really struggled. And there's games where I couldn't. Either one, the club team had to manage me, or two, where, basically I couldn't play. It was just a matter of, either, managing myself so I could get on the rugby field. So, yeah, it did have its a downside, and I paid a little bit of the price over that period, but it just is what it was,
Mm-hmm. And walking out onto the pitch in Brisbane for that first game in 2003 against Fiji after coming back, an emotional experience, I imagine?
I don't know. Every time you play international rugby, or every time I pulled on that blue jersey, it was always emotional. But again, there was something extra in that. I guess it was a significant time for me in that I'd come back and beat cancer, so to speak. And, I was back to doing what I love doing.
Mm-hmm. And that tournament itself then, you got as far as the semi-final, as you mentioned, and ran into pretty much an unstoppable England. I covered England a few weeks ago and I spoke to Neil back about it, and we were talking about this game, that semi-final, and they didn't score a try at all, but it was just, I think, kind of classic cup rugby of Johnny Wilkinson just picking off the drop goals and penalties as the game went on, and just ultimately England really just kind of had France at arm's length for much of that game, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a funny game. I think, looking back, right up until that semi-final, we'd played some decent rugby. We'd played pretty well.
Hammered Ireland in the quarterfinals.
Yeah. The week before, we'd won well against Ireland. And we're pretty confident. We're playing a sort of a pretty good brand of rugby. And then I remember when we walked out of the hotel to go to that game, it started raining and pouring down, which probably didn't suit us. But got on the bus and headed out there and, played the first 40 minutes, and I think we're down something like 11-7 at half-time and really hadn't done a thing, hadn't fired a shot, and was like, we're still in it and we haven't really done anything. And we went out in that second half and, again, we did nothing. And it was really an anti-climax to our World Cup because, again, we'd been playing so well and then come out And you know, one thing is to lose a semi-final in a World Cup. You're always disappointed, but probably more so than that was the way that we played and that we actually didn't perform. But in saying that, you know, at the time, you know, England were a very good side, and probably over that, you know, especially leading up into that World Cup, they're probably, you know, the best team in world rugby at the time. So, yeah.
In the third place playoff, then you obviously came across New Zealand, and they were the team then that you actually played in the what proved to be the last of your Test matches for France in 2004, the All Blacks. How did that feel going out against the country where you grew up in, where, as you said yourself, you grew up wanting to play for?
Yes. Well, you know, I got to play against against New Zealand on 2 occasions. You know, that third place game in Sydney after our semi-final defeats, and I guess it's a game where neither team really wants to be there. You know, exactly. You go to a World Cup to win the final, and so to lose a semi-final and then 4 days later you've got to pull on the boots and play off for third place. You know, it's not necessarily easy. But what I will say is that, you know, my last game in Paris in 2004 in the blue jersey was something special. Again, like you said, it was against New Zealand, but a whole lot of emotion that went with it. I think, you know, to this day, it's one of my, you know, a great, one of my memories, or as the French say, souvenirs in my blue jersey. And even though we got well beaten on that day, I think there's a lot of emotion and obviously singing the national anthems. And I remember singing those national anthems, you know, I had tears in my eyes. And one, you know, I was very proud as a Kiwi and being brought up in New Zealand, but also very proud to be playing for that French side. And so a lot of emotion. And, you know, after that game, I was on cloud 9 for weeks. So probably, you know, looking back, it probably couldn't have finished better. You know, a win would have been nice, but, you know, to finish my last game in blue playing against the All Blacks in Paris, it couldn't have been better. And
at the time, did you know it was going to be your last game for France, or were you kind of left out of teams after that, or had you kind of made a decision yourself that was the right moment?
No, I didn't actually announce my retirement from international rugby, but going into that game, I didn't know it would be my last game and playing for France. But I guess, you know, to be fair, I was getting on. I think I was probably 33, so I was getting on in age. And, you know, I was probably, you know, if I'm honest, I was probably at the top of my career, or just going over that crest. So, you know, the chances of getting back into that blue team were always going to be tough. Mm-hmm.
And, you know, in the last few years, you are back in New Zealand since you retired. You're in Auckland. What are you at these days?
So, I sold it since retiring from rugby. I stayed with it and got involved in the strength and conditioning side of things. So I had a year at Clermont-Ferrand and then returned home to complete a degree and have coached various teams back here. But I resigned from New Zealand squash about 6 years ago, and I set up a business which I sold my shares in last year. So I'm sort of in between right now. So looking at other opportunities right now.
Okay, and just a quick word then on the World Cup. Who's your fancy for the tournament? New Zealand, they've been playing the last couple of weeks in the Rugby Championship, off this weekend. What's the feeling like for them?
Yeah, I guess it's different from other World Cups. You know, usually over the last 2 or 3 World Cups, you've gone in a couple of clear favourites, where I think it's a little bit different this time. I think if you look at New Zealand, I think they haven't played well. Don't get me wrong; they're a very good side and probably, you know, still one of the hot favourites to win the World Cup. But if you have a look at their performances over the last, you know, 3 or 4 years, but they haven't. To me, they haven't been the side that they had been leading up into that 2015 World Cup. I think they're a side which, unlike some of the other World Cups, you know, that they're missing some clear combinations. I think, they still haven't settled on their back three. So that's going to be interesting with who they decide to come with there. Obviously, big question mark around Brodie Retallick and whether he makes the World Cup. But then, I think there's questions around that number 10 position. I think, we saw as their last test against South Africa where they moved Mwanga to 10 and Barrett to fullback. Are they going to go with that? My opinion is that they need to. I think that, and probably I might get berated here, but to me, Beauden Barrett, don't get me wrong, a fantastic player, but at number 10 he can sometimes struggle, especially if that black forward pack isn't going forward. But the other question mark is around that midfield combination. So to me, they haven't got a clear combination of who's going to play in that midfield yet. Some question marks around them. Obviously, South Africa performed well last week, but so they could be in the hunt. But if you have a look to the Northern Hemisphere, I guess the big question mark around the Northern Hemisphere teams for me is the consistency. Mm. So to me, I'll go back to 2003 when England last was, the only team that won the World Cup, a Northern Hemisphere team that won it. They were consistent and were playing good rugby for, a number of years leading up into that World Cup. Where you have a look at since then, no really Northern Hemisphere team for me has really stood out. You've got England has had the years, Ireland last year, Wales this year, and I don't know who's going to front up and this year for the Northern Hemisphere team. So it's going to be interesting. I think without a doubt, the likes of Ireland, Wales, England, maybe France, maybe Scotland. I don't know. The goods to upset some teams, but the big question for me is the consistency.
Okay, Tony, on that note, we'll say goodbye. Thank you for joining us on Land of the Rising Scrum.
Great, my pleasure.
Yes, we are continuing our look through on France here on Land of the Rising Scrum. Just a reminder as well, if you want to listen back to any of our previous episodes, you can do so at offtheball.com/podcasts and just find the rugby section there. They'll all be there. Alternatively as well, you can watch these back on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/offtheball. And just a reminder as well that our rugby coverage on Off the Ball is brought to you by Vodafone. Team of us, everyone in. Now, joining me next on the line to speak about France is a Welsh journalist based over in France working with AFP Sports, Illtud Dafydd. Thanks a million for joining us this afternoon.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me.
Your own background, I suppose, if we could actually just start on that. So you're working over there with AFP Sports. You've been in France for around a year or so now, yeah?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. So I moved over last November to cover all parts of sport, and part of that is covering the wonderful French national team.
And you're never short of stories, I imagine, working following the French rugby team.
It's a very interesting team to follow. Generally, French rugby is a bit crazy, it's a bit different. Because there's so many professional teams, so many professional players, so many professional club presidents who kind of want to have their opinion as well. It's an incredible sort of thing to follow and to keep an eye on. And the French national team, as it is now, I don't think it's been in this sort of state ever before, really, when you've got a coach in Jacques Brunel who really doesn't do any coaching. He's more just there as the face. And then Fabien Galtier, former France scrum half, who's just been brought in as a consultant, but really does the majority of the coaching on the training paddock.
Yeah, it's a funny situation because, if I'm right in saying, officially Fabien Galtier isn't the head coach until after the World Cup, but essentially he kind of is at the moment anyway.
Yeah, he's a boss all but in name, realistically. A colleague of mine, Pierre-Yvon, was down in Monaco during their camp on the French South Coast last week, and he was telling me, when I spoke to him, that Galtier was doing all the coaching on the training paddock, and Brunel was just stood there on his own on the touchline. It's probably quite a sad sight to see a 65-year-old man doing that and losing all his power, but that's kind of what happens when you've got someone like Benoît Laporte as president, who is incredibly determined to get this French team back on track.
And it just is, I suppose it almost seems incredibly French that all these kind of coaching shake-ups and revolts, over the last decade or so, they have always just seemed to time themselves perfectly for a World Cup. Because in 2011, you had Marc Livremont, and earlier on in this show, I spoke to Jerome Thion about how he was one of those players a few months before the World Cup who was just completely annexed from the squad completely. And it leads to the point where there is this player revolt against Livremont mid-World Cup, and the players go on and lead themselves to the final. And, you know, as we've all seen, almost gave New Zealand the shock of all time in the decider as well. And then in 2015, when they were just a complete disaster and hockeyed in the quarter-final against New Zealand, and we heard then as well that there were senior players who just weren't really listening to the coaching staff whatsoever. And it brings us to 2019 as well, where it just seems like all those little pieces are being put in place for the players just ignoring management once again.
I'd agree with you on 2011 and 2015, especially with Jerome Thion's thoughts. But I think this squad, it's a little bit different maybe. You have the characters that are in the squad, the big characters, the players that would normally start the game aren't really that experienced. Yeah, you've got someone like Guillaume Guiraudot as captain, but his experience and someone like Louis Picamont, number 8, both their experience outweighs so much the rest of the team realistically. Because if you look at the starting halfback partnership, it's probably going to be Antoine Dupont and either Romain Ntamack or Thomas Ramos, who haven't even got 20 caps each between them. So I wouldn't predict that much, and I think a lot of the players, they seem to respect, and all that's coming out of the camp currently is it's all quite positive, and the reaction to what Fabien Galtier's got them doing and the reaction that the new fitness coach Thibaut Gilles has got them doing is all pretty positive. Yeah, they're finding it difficult. It's incredibly fatiguing. They've been expected to run a lot, but it's all quite positive. But hey, you never know with the French. You could always get a revolution, a revolt midway through the tournament. It's difficult to say, but at the moment, all things seem to point to the direction they're all going in the same direction. But hey, you have to wait and see with this French team, I think. Yeah,
it could only be a couple of days. By the time this goes out on air, things could have all gone completely arseways. You'd never know. But when the squad was kind of initially, the World Cup training squad, much earlier in the summer now, the big name that was left out, Teddy Thomas, everyone was looking at and was just really, really surprised he wasn't there. Were there any other major shocks in there as well? And is Thomas, but is there still a faint chance that he could make his way back into this before the tournament?
In France, I don't think there was that much of a shock to see Thomas omitted from the squad realistically. He hasn't played much. He's been in quite good form for Racing, but for France, he's been injured yet. He didn't play in the Six Nations, so he's been kind of out anyway. So there wasn't much expectation of seeing him included. The big exclusions were Mathieu Bastareaud and Morgan Parra. It's quite interesting. We were having discussions in the office of which one was the biggest exclusion. Bastareaud, so many caps, experience, plays at centre, or Morgan Parra, who controls the game so well, had a superb season with Clermont, winning the European Challenge Cup, runner-up in the top 14 as well, despite him missing the final through injury. And that's what Brunel said, that he picked Maxime Machinot over Parra because of the Clermont scrum half's injury problems. But yeah, the big thing probably is Bastareaud, maybe because he's a bit more of a character, he's a bit more of a personality, speaks a bit better in the press as well, and people just know him more. He's a bigger name. So that was the biggest shock, realistically. Then the people who've come in for them, as I said, they're Machinot for Parra. It's all right, but Parra wasn't really guaranteed a starting place if you look at how good someone like Antoine Dupont has been playing both on the national and the club level. But then in midfield, Bastareaud, he was the vice-captain of France, and Brunel even brought him in instead of Guiraudot against Wales in the Six Nations in 2018 when the hooker had a knee problem. So that's the big shock, really. And then Bastareaud, who he could possibly be playing, he would have been playing alongside Wesley Fofana in midfield. But then you look at the form of someone like Sofiane Guitoun, who's been superb for Toulouse, hasn't played for the French team since the last World Cup. So it was a shock, yes. But at the same time, the players who they brought in are quality individuals as well.
In terms of the Six Nations, I think a lot of us probably got very, very excited in those first 40 minutes against Wales when France were looking absolutely fantastic. They were throwing the ball around, they were building up this lead, and it just seemed from that moment on everything just kind of really collapsed in on top of itself. They were quite terrible against England. They were absolutely awful against Ireland as well. And in the second half against Wales, it was that other side of France, the complete calamity, the passes being thrown everywhere, the intercepts going all over the place. By the end of the Six Nations, it seemed like the patience had really worn thin. In terms of the public opinion on the French team, what has that been like since the Six Nations, and has the kind of unofficial coaching changes changed that in any way?
Firstly, as a Welshman, those 40 minutes in Paris weren't great. The second 40 were much better. Yeah, it wasn't a vintage French Six Nations. They showed some glimpses of what they can do against Scotland, and ironically it was Mathieu Bastareaud who stood out with a nice little chip kick, etc. But then also you had someone like Thomas Ramos starring as well. Beating Italy was kind of expected, even though they did it in the most un-French and unattractive way possible, but they got the victory. I'm not too sure what the public opinion is really. What a lot of my friends talk about really when they ask them about France is they just call Jacques Brunel the grandpa, Papi Brunel, because of his age, 65. He's one of the oldest coaches who will be at the Rugby World Cup, and they all seem to feel not sympathy or sorry for him, but they just feel like he's kind of a puppet to Laporte to a certain extent. And with that, there's also comes sympathy for the French national team, which isn't really great. You don't want to be feeling sorry for your national rugby team, do you? You want to really be getting behind them. But at the same time, I think French do continue to have this sort of positivity around this team, because they do know that there are incredible talents within the squad individually. Some of them are superb, and you see what Toulouse managed to do, not just in top 14 but also in Europe, and the way that Toulouse managed to win the French domestic title and also get to the European semi-final, and there's 7 of their squad members in this 31-man World Cup squad, then there is positivity around it to a certain extent.
Is there any worry, though, like we mentioned Toulouse and how they went on and won the top 14 and performed so well in Europe this year, though, is there any worry at the moment that it's actually quite recently where they did win that top 14 title, like that season ended very, very late for a World Cup year? There's a lot of players there who have had a pretty small break. Like, it has always been an issue in France over the last few years since that money came in, where the clubs are really running things and they're getting their own way. And it kind of feels like it's no surprise that the national team has suffered alongside of that.
It's one of the things that Bernard Laporte has tried to address since he became president of the French Union. Yes, the clubs do hold a lot of power, mainly because the presidents pay the players' salaries at the end of the day. But they had a month off. I think they delayed the return or the start of the pre-World Cup camp for the semi-finalists and the Lyon La Rochelle players, and also the finalists in Toulouse and Clermont. They delayed them to help them to give them the 4 weeks that they need off. And also, if you add on that how intense the training camp has been for the past 4 weeks, then it's been probably quite difficult. But at the same time, from what's been coming out of the camp, from the players and the coaches and stuff, they do these kind of blocks where they're intense for a couple of weeks and they get given 5 days off, like they are currently, to go and spend time with their families, etc., to properly relax, and they're back in for some more intense work as well. So time will tell how that affects. If they do maybe blow up halfway through the World Cup and just like collapse after, after the USA game, they just find it too much after playing 2 games. We won't really know until we get to late September. But all things said is that this is meant to be the most intense physical preparation that France have ever had. Pretty hard to disagree with that, because how do you judge that? But at the same time, yeah, there probably will be a little bit of a problem that they don't get rest as other teams. If you look at other teams' physical preparations, Wales, they're also saying that they're going to go being put through the ringer as they've been in Switzerland as well. Yeah,
it seems everyone is physically preparing better than everyone else at the moment. It's kind of what we just hear this time of year, isn't it? But last couple of questions, like, is there, given the pool itself, England, Argentina, Tonga as well. Tonga, who can be dangerous on their day as well, on the USA. Is there a danger and a real fear in France that you could potentially be looking at not actually getting out of the pool stage entirely?
100%.
And what happens then? Is the question. Like, if Galtier is unofficially running the show there and they weren't to get out of the pool stage, is Galtier still coming in after the World Cup?
Nothing's guaranteed really with French rugby, and especially someone like Bernard Laporte, who likes to make decisions quite rashly, I think. But yeah, it all depends really, because France aren't guaranteed to get a quarter-final spot. They're not even guaranteed to get 2 wins really. Because France and England and Argentina are difficult. We all know that they're the top 10 teams in the world, etc., etc. But they lost to Tonga at the 2011 World Cup, USA looking quite good. They were quite impressive against the very poor Canada last weekend. So there's a lot of talk of if we get the quarterfinals, when we get the quarterfinals, can we get the quarterfinals? They can do, but what's difficult, I think, for them is in recent years when they've played against Argentina at World Cups, they haven't been too great. It's not that they're a bogey team, but there seems to be a very interesting relationship between Argentina and France. They're probably the only national team within the top 10 who aren't part of this English language framework. I don't know how much that works into things. Their rugby cultures are very different to what you get in Ireland or down in New Zealand or in Australia or in South Africa or even in Wales, etc., etc. And they do have an incredibly interesting relationship. Mario Ledesma played for so many years in Castres and for Clermont. So yeah, I don't know really. It could be something that France's World Cup could be over by the 2nd of October after they lose the US, or it could be over with another final appearance in Yokohama.
And final question then, Illtud, on that basis, what is the bare minimum that France have to achieve at the World Cup? What is the absolute, like, what is acceptable, what is unacceptable at this World Cup?
Internally, I think there's a lot of talk about they have to get the quarterfinal spot. They have to. Even Jefferson Poirot, the Bordeaux-Bègles prop, has come out and said that you can't apologise if you don't get to the. There's no excuse for not getting to the quarterfinal, and I think that's what it is. So internally, externally, from the fans, they have to get to quarterfinal, because France, they've always reached quarterfinal, and either how many times they failed, that was 91 and 2015. Apart from that, they always seem to be a team who can turn up for a World Cup. They've got this incredible history with the World Cup where they turn up and just beat the All Blacks like without any problem. So there is an expectation. I don't know if it's an expectation about their squad specifically, but it's an expectation that France do have to do well at World Cups. Like in any sporting event, they have to do well at World Championships because there's such a high regard for the national team. So yeah, a quarter-final, I think France would be very happy. Anything more, they'd be shocked. Anything less, they'd be very disappointed.
Okay, Illtud, on that note, thanks a million for joining us here on Land of the Rising Scrum.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.